Hi, I'm Jenna.
I'm Haley.
I'm Kara. We are in Fundamentals of Learner Motivation, and
This is for you, Stallman!
Okay, take it away, Jenna.
Alright, so we looked at the study and approach of the looking glass. So we've got this guy Hirschberger, and he got together chicks and wanted to put them in an alleyway with a food bowl, and the food bowl moved in the same direction that the chicks moved. But before we get into that, we've got prior research asserting that organisms are closed-loop mechanisms that realize their intentions by means of negative feedback. So in terms of the chicks, this means that when they would move towards the food bowl, they would get the food. Hirschberger wanted to instill positive feedback, so this means that when chicks would run away from the food bowl, they would actually get the food bowl. And when they ran towards it, the food would move away from them. So ultimately in this experiment, Hirschberger wanted to test the prediction that instrumental behaviors of these chicks would be seriously impaired by a simple polarity reversal of its feedback. So we've got hungry young chicks with limited locomotor experience, and they were tested for their ability to approach this food dish in a straight runway. Chicks were tested individually containing a food bowl from which they had been trained to eat. The food bowl moved along the length of the alleyway in the same direction that the chicks moved. For half the chicks, the bowl moved twice as far as the chick. For the remaining half, the bowl moved half as far as the chick. For half of those groups, the bowl alone moved, and for the remaining half the chicks, total visible environment moved. So according to the closed-loop thesis, the experimental condition in which the chick's visible environment is moved in the same direction and twice as far as the chick, this would reverse the polarity of the loop's feedback, and ultimately the chick should be unable to consummate his approach responses. Instead, he should persistently chase the food cup away from himself, showing the runaway behavior of a control loop subjected to positive feedback. Alright, so moving either the food cup alone or the entire visible environment in the same direction and half as far as the chick should not reverse the polarity of feedback. Therefore, this should not impair the chick's behavior. So ultimately, Hirschberger wanted to know through this experiment, would the chicks walk the other way, thus getting the food bowl, or would they merely run after the receding food cup, as the closed-loop thesis predicts, and they would never be able to obtain the food.
So, the procedure of this group was set up in 4 groups of 10 subjects each. Okay, alright. The procedure of this experiment was as follows. There were 4 experiments.
Today.
I know. The procedure of this experiment were as follows. There were 4 groups of 10 subjects each. The 4 experimental conditions were 1. Shell environment with positive feedback, labeled as S+. 2. Shell environment with negative feedback, labeled as S-. 3. Railing with positive feedback, labeled as R+. And 4. Railing with negative feedback, labeled as R-. All chicks in a given group were tested at the same time. In the chicks' home cage, they were provided with a water tube and a food bowl. The light-proof box in which the 10 cages were a part of was illuminated for 5 minutes on every hour. During this 5 minutes, the chicks were eating regularly. On the 3rd day, however, the food was removed from the cages, and the chicks experienced an overnight 11-hour deprivation period of food. On the 4th and following days, the chicks were tested immediately after deprivation, so they were hungry. After each training and test session, food was placed in the home cages to re-remove later. The goal of the training were to get the chicks comfortable and familiar with the apparatus, as well as eating food from the cup. Towards the end of training, all chicks would immediately begin to eat when placed next to the cup. On the 4th day, each chick received 20 training trials. The apparatus provided the bowl at the goal position. The tracking device was inactive, therefore the alley was eliminated. The chick was placed into the alley, allowed to eat for several seconds, and then tested. 4 blocks of 5 trials were separated by intervals for at least an hour. The goal of testing was to facilitate food-getting orientation for the chick and prevent exploratory behavior. The chicks were placed at starting positions labeled as 1, 2, 3, or 4, 1 being closest to the food and 4 the farthest. During the test trial, chicks were placed into a darkened alley. Chicks, known to be inactive in the dark, stayed very close to the starting position until the light switched on, which also initiated the clock. If the chick reached the food cup within 1 minute, they were allowed 5 seconds to eat. This was labeled as a successful trial. However, if the chick did not reach within 1 minute, they were moved to their home cage with no food. If a chick were successful on 4 consecutive trials at position 1, they therefore moved to 2 and eventually 4, testing their skill and making it harder each time.
So, what the researchers found. Hirschberger found that the negative feedback groups had the highest success rate because they were able to learn that when they withdrew from the food bowl would approach them. On the contrary, the positive feedback group had a lower success rate because they kept approaching the food bowl and did not learn that the withdrawal behavior was the key to obtaining food. This supports the idea that organisms are closed group mechanisms that realize their intentions by means of negative feedback. In addition, this experiment supports the idea that the polarity of feedback is a critical factor, meaning the chicks had trouble making sense of what was going on when they were confronted with an abnormal environment, which in this case was the bowl either moving away from them or towards them. Hirschberger states in his paper, all in all, the present results provide convincing evidence that it is possible to disable a naive organism simply by reversing the spatial polarity of its environmental feedback.
Let us show you the graph.
It can be seen here that the negative feedback groups took significantly less time to reach the bowl, thus making them more successful than the positive feedback groups.
Man, that Hirschenberg guy really knows what he's saying.
Hirschberger.
Man, that Hirschberger guy really knows his stuff. I wish there was a way to, relate this information back to the real world.
You mean like the greater implications of this research?
I do.
Well,
That's
I guess,
exactly what I
Kara,
mean.
There is.
Well, please tell me.
Anything for you. Ultimately, what we can take away from this is that humans have the ability to reorganize information that's been reversed. And this suggests that we are creatures that are more perceptual rather than effector. So that's interesting.
That is
so
interesting.
interesting.
So if you placed humans in this sort of experiment, and instead of food, it were drugs, do you think the same results would apply?
Oh, that's interesting.
We should do more research to find out. And
We
maybe
should.
post a video later on about that.
I'm sure Stallman would be interested in that video.
Yes.
All right.
How about that?